In the uneasy summer of 1945, when the world was still breathing in the silence that followed the end of World War II, most of the major decisions shaping the post-war order were expected to emerge from one man, Winston Churchill. For years, he had been the voice of defiance, the symbol of Allied resolve, the statesman whose words seemed to bend the arc of history, and yet, within weeks, an American president who had never sought global leadership would quietly tell Churchill something the British Prime Minister never expected to hear. No, it didn't happen with raised voices, dramatic gestures, or any of the pageantry that defined the British leader's style. Instead, it was delivered with the calm, straightforward tone that Harry S. Truman had carried with him since his days as a county judge in Missouri. Churchill, who had grown accustomed to Roosevelt's fluid, charismatic dance of diplomacy, was suddenly confronted with a man who preferred clarity over charm. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more videos on Truman and Churchill, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Their clash began at Potsdam, where the ruins of Berlin still smoldered on the horizon and Europe's future hung in the balance. Churchill arrived with a notebook full of ideas, punishments, boundaries, committees, strategic balances. Truman arrived with a pencil, a few carefully folded briefing papers, and an understanding that the United States would no longer follow Britain's lead by default. To Churchill, the shift was jarring. He had spent the war speaking with Roosevelt as an equal partner, each helping shape the other's views. Now, the new American president was treating Britain's once dominant voice as one perspective among many. It wasn't the change in tone that unsettled Churchill. It was the realization that the United States had discovered its own direction, one that did not always align with London's vision. The first real moment of friction came over the treatment of Germany. Churchill believed in a measured approach, one that would prevent the country from rising again as a threat while preserving enough stability to rebuild Europe. Truman, influenced by a different set of advisors and by the American public's exhaustion with war, was leaning toward firmer controls and more immediate demands. Their positions were not opposites, but they diverged enough to reveal a new imbalance in the partnership. Churchill argued his case with the sweeping language that had rallied Britain through its darkest hours. Truman listened, nodded, and then quietly repeated what he had said earlier. The United States would decide its course based on American priorities. Churchill pressed harder. He reminded Truman of the cost Britain had paid, of the dead cities, the lost generation, the moral responsibility Europe now faced. Truman recognized the sacrifices, deeply, sincerely, but he had not come to Potsdam to be persuaded by rhetoric, no matter how powerful. And so, as the conversations continued behind closed doors, a pattern emerged. Churchill would insist on a certain approach. Truman would listen respectfully. Then he would say no. No, the United States would not support certain punitive measures. No, Washington would not automatically endorse Britain's preferred strategy in Eastern Europe. No, the American delegation would not wait for further British deliberation. It was a new dynamic, one Churchill understood intellectually but had not yet accepted emotionally. Truman respected Churchill deeply, but he did not defer to him. Not in tone, not in posture, not in substance. Outside the conference hall, British journalists wondered why Churchill looked more tired than usual. Few understood what was unfolding inside. A slow, quiet recognition that Britain no longer guided the world's agenda. The war had exhausted the empire, drained its finances, and left it dependent on American support, in ways Churchill could not publicly admit. Truman did not intend to humble Britain, but he did intend to define America's role clearly, firmly, and independently. In the days before the British election, Churchill attempted one more time to align Truman with his vision. They met privately for what Churchill hoped would be a decisive conversation, an opportunity to find common ground and re-establish the wartime partnership on familiar terms. His staff expected hours of discussion. The meeting lasted barely half that. Truman was gracious, warm, and unmovable. When Churchill outlined a strategy for dealing with Stalin's growing power, Truman interrupted only once, to ask a clarifying question. But when Churchill finished, Truman simply returned to the same principle that had guided his choices since becoming president. The United States would not be drawn into policies that did not match its long-term interests. Churchill's frustration was not rooted in disrespect. In fact, he admired Truman's directness. What troubled him was the unmistakable reality that Britain's voice, so powerful during the war, no longer carried the same weight. The American president was not waiting for guidance. He was setting the direction. Days later, Churchill returned home to a political defeat that stunned much of the world. Clement Attlee replaced him at the conference table. Truman, who had only just begun learning to balance Churchill's personality with his own instincts, now faced a new British leader who shared even fewer assumptions about the post-war order. Yet the tension between Truman and Churchill did not disappear with the election. It simply moved into a new phase, one defined not by personal dynamics, but by the larger question facing Europe: who would lead its reconstruction? In the months that followed, Churchill watched from the sidelines as Truman took several steps that formally established America's dominance in shaping the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the rebuilding of Germany, and the early foundations of NATO were all initiatives that emanated not from London, but from Washington. And at nearly every point, Truman's choices differed from the path Churchill had once imagined. Churchill believed Europe's salvation required a blend of old-world diplomacy and imperial experience. Truman believed Europe needed resources, stability, and a clear boundary against Soviet expansion. Churchill saw the United States as a partner. Truman saw it as the new anchor. Their visions were not antagonistic, but they were distinct. Where Churchill spoke of destiny and civilization, Truman spoke of budgets and logistics. Where Churchill warned of the moral stakes, Truman emphasized the practical steps required to secure peace. Churchill's early sense that Truman might drift or defer, that he might lack the authority to define America's path, had proven entirely wrong. But what Churchill did not yet realize was that Truman's refusal to follow Britain's lead was not a sign of obstinacy. It was the first step in creating a framework that would eventually hold Europe together. By 1947, Churchill began to speak publicly of the United States' moral responsibility. He praised the Marshall Plan as a noble initiative and acknowledged privately that Truman's decisions, though different from his own, were achieving something remarkable. They were restoring Europe's confidence in its future. Still, Churchill could not forget the moment at Potsdam when Truman first said no, the quiet, unyielding refusal that marked the end of a wartime era and the beginning of a new transatlantic order. He could not forget the look on Truman's face, earnest and resolute, as he explained that America's path would not be shaped by rhetoric, tradition, or nostalgia. It would be shaped by purpose. And as the Cold War took hold, Truman's sense of purpose, once dismissed as inexperience, became the axis on which the Western alliance turned. By the late 1940s, the world had changed. Churchill, now warning of an iron curtain stretching across the continent, recognized that Truman's instincts at Potsdam were not impulsive or dismissive. They were prophetic. Truman had understood, earlier than most, that the world could not return to the patterns that governed the pre-war decades. The United States could not simply reinforce Britain's leadership. It had to create a new foundation, and that foundation began with a simple word: no. The consequences of that refusal, and the new course it set in motion, would become clearer in the years that followed. Truman's choices reshaped Europe's recovery, established a transatlantic alliance, and defined the opening chapter of the Cold War. The years after Churchill's electoral defeat brought a kind of quiet clarity to the relationship between the two men. Churchill, now speaking from outside government, observed Truman's decisions with increasing respect, even as he recognized how different their instincts had been in those early months of peace. Yet the deeper meaning of Truman's refusal at Potsdam, his simple decision to chart America's own course, would only become fully visible as Europe entered a more ominous chapter. By 1948, the continent was no longer simply recovering from war. It was dividing. The fragile hope of cooperative peace with the Soviet Union evaporated in a series of crises, each more alarming than the last. In Prague, a democratic government collapsed beneath communist pressure. In Berlin, the Soviet blockade tightened day by day, threatening to starve 2 million civilians into submission. Churchill saw these developments with a familiar dread. He had warned repeatedly that the post-war moment carried within it the seeds of a new conflict. But what he had not predicted was how quickly Truman would step into the role history demanded. The American president whom Churchill once viewed as inexperienced was now facing a challenge greater than any peacetime leader had ever confronted. The Berlin blockade became the defining test of Truman's leadership. It was the moment when all the cautious decisions he had made, decisions Churchill once viewed as frustratingly restrained, coalesced into something larger. It was not a moment suited to Churchill's rhetorical thunder or Roosevelt's soaring improvisation. It was a moment suited to Truman's measured determination. When Soviet forces sealed off Berlin's roads and rails, many believed Truman would negotiate, concede a few points, or quietly withdraw from the city altogether. The United States, they argued, had no obligation to remain in a territory deep inside the Soviet zone. Why risk confrontation over a city most Americans could not locate on a map? Churchill was not among those urging retreat, but privately, he wondered whether Truman would be able to sustain a prolonged confrontation. Britain had neither the resources nor the political appetite for another extended struggle. And though Churchill trusted Truman's moral convictions, he doubted whether the American public would support a costly effort that promised no immediate reward. But once again, Truman's answer showed a quality Churchill had underestimated, a quality that would define not just the crisis, but the entire shape of the Cold War. Truman said no to withdrawal, no to negotiations that legitimized Soviet pressure, no to abandoning Berliners who had placed their hope in the Western Allies. Instead, he authorized an unprecedented operation, an airlift that would supply the city entirely from the sky. It was a plan that defied logic, arithmetic, and even physics. At first, the numbers were grim. The required tonnage seemed impossible. Weather posed constant danger. Mechanical failures were frequent. But Truman did not retreat. He told his aides simply, "We stay in Berlin. And if the only way to stay is through the air, then we go through the air." Churchill watched the first reports of the airlift with a growing sense of awe. He understood logistics. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty. He knew what it meant to sustain operations under pressure. And he realized, perhaps earlier than Truman's own critics, that the success of the airlift would reshape Europe's perception of American will. Within weeks, the flights multiplied. The pathways grew more efficient. The pilots became veterans of a new kind of mission, one without guns, but filled with danger. Families in Berlin began to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft as the sound of survival. American and British crews flew side by side, weaving a bridge across hostile skies. Churchill recognized the symbolism immediately. This was not merely a humanitarian effort. It was the opening statement of a new strategy, one that declared, without rhetoric or spectacle, that the West would not retreat. The blockade failed in May 1949. After nearly a year of pressure, the Soviet Union lifted its restrictions. It was a moment of triumph, though not one marked with grand celebrations. Truman received the news quietly, as he did with most victories. Churchill, watching from afar, felt a mixture of pride and humility. The man he once feared might yield to pressure had instead demonstrated remarkable resolve. Truman's earlier refusal to let Churchill dictate the post-war path now seemed not like defiance, but foresight. If the United States had followed Britain's preferred approach, the West might have lacked the unity required to face the blockade. Britain was exhausted. Its empire was shrinking. Its economy was fragile. Truman had seen clearly what Churchill had long struggled to accept. Leadership of the free world had already shifted across the Atlantic. But their differences did not diminish Churchill's admiration. On the contrary, they deepened it. As Churchill traveled the world giving speeches about unity and vigilance, he increasingly framed Truman as the indispensable figure of the early Cold War. He called him steadfast, honest, and unafraid to carry burdens others avoided. And yet, Churchill also recognized that Truman's greatest contribution lay in something quieter. He had created a stable foundation for a transatlantic alliance that would outlast them both. That foundation took shape through the Marshall Plan, through support for Greece and Turkey, through the careful rebuilding of West Germany, through the creation of NATO in 1949, which Churchill immediately endorsed as the anchor Western Europe desperately needed. None of these initiatives followed the script Churchill had imagined in 1945. None emerged from the strategic worldview Churchill wanted America to adopt. And yet, each proved crucial. Churchill understood, perhaps reluctantly, that Truman's refusal at Potsdam had paved the way for these achievements. The United States had not been dragged by British priorities. It had acted according to American ones, and those priorities had proven remarkably suited to the realities of the post-war world. By the time Churchill returned to office in 1951, the Cold War had crystallized. The world was divided clearly, sometimes brutally, along ideological lines. And the Western alliance, shaped by Truman's decisions, stood firmer than Churchill could have hoped in the immediate aftermath of the war. When the two leaders met again, their dynamic was different. Churchill no longer approached Truman as the lone guardian of experience. He approached him as a partner and, in many ways, as a student of how American leadership had evolved. Truman, for his part, treated Churchill with warmth and respect, but he did not defer. He had grown into the role no one expected him to fill. During one of their meetings, Churchill praised the Marshall Plan in unusually emotional terms. Truman listened silently, nodding occasionally. When Churchill finished, Truman simply said he was proud that the United States had done something useful in a world filled with uncertainty. Churchill later recounted the moment as a reminder of Truman's character. He did not seek glory. He sought stability, and that, Churchill later concluded, was precisely why Truman had succeeded. As Truman prepared to leave office in 1953, he reflected privately on the early days of his presidency, the days when Churchill arrived with the confidence of a wartime titan, and Truman felt like an understudy thrust onto the world stage. He remembered their disagreements, their debates, the way Churchill tried to pull him toward Britain's vision of Europe's future. But Truman also remembered the moment he chose to set America's own course. He did not see it as a rejection of Churchill. He saw it as the responsibility of a leader answerable not to history's giants, but to the people who had entrusted him with power. For Churchill, that moment became one of the defining revelations of the post-war era. The world he had once shaped through speeches, alliances, and determination was now in the hands of a nation that had never sought empire, but now bore global responsibility. Truman had not diminished Churchill's legacy. He had ensured it would endure within a larger, more stable framework. In his later writings, Churchill reflected on Truman with candid admiration. He praised Truman's moral courage, his decisiveness, and his ability to make choices others avoided. He admitted that the American president's refusal at Potsdam, frustrating as it had been, proved essential. It signaled to allies and rivals alike that the United States would not be a secondary voice in global affairs. It would lead on its own terms. And so, as the decades passed and historians traced the early contours of the Cold War, many arrived at the same conclusion. Churchill's vision helped define the era, but Truman's decisions built its foundation. And so, as the decades passed and historians traced the early contours of the Cold War, many arrived at the same conclusion. Churchill's vision helped define the era, but Truman's decisions built its foundation. Yet between those two truths lay a complicated middle ground, one shaped not by dramatic speeches or grand declarations, but by a series of quiet choices, late-night meetings, and uneasy compromises. Churchill had spent years thinking in the language of empire and destiny. Truman, by contrast, thought in terms of practicalities, budgets, votes, alliances, limits, and how to prevent another global catastrophe without bankrupting the nation that had just fought one. And in that difference, a subtle friction grew. Churchill saw the Soviet threat rising like a dark tide and demanded the West confront it openly, urgently, without hesitation. He believed only boldness could deter Stalin. Truman agreed with the danger, but not the method. He preferred to build strength step by step. Aid for Europe, a stabilized Germany, a unified Western alliance, and a foreign policy that could be sustained for decades, not weeks. Where Churchill pushed for declarations, Truman pushed for institutions. Where Churchill wanted moral clarity, Truman wanted strategic patience. Some diplomats at the time feared that this gap between the two men might fracture the West at its most vulnerable moment, but instead, it produced something more durable, a balance. Churchill's warnings gave Truman the political space to act more decisively than he otherwise could. Truman's restraint ensured that Churchill's grand warnings did not pull the world into a confrontation it was not prepared to survive. Their friction created momentum. Their disagreement created direction. And in that delicate push and pull, the early Cold War found its shape, a shape neither man could have achieved alone. Their partnership was imperfect, sometimes tense, often misaligned, but it was also transformative. Truman provided discipline where Churchill offered prophecy. Churchill provided urgency where Truman offered stability. Together, through disagreements and reluctant respect, they shaped a world that might otherwise have fractured under the weight of competing ambitions. Looking back now, it becomes clear that Truman's refusal was never about rejecting Churchill. It was about accepting the role history had placed upon him, a role he neither sought nor expected, but one he carried with steadiness that surprised even those closest to him. So, now I want to hear from you. If you had stood beside these two men in the uncertain months after World War II, whose instincts would you have trusted? Churchill's sweeping warnings, or Truman's steady, deliberate path? And how do you think their contrasting visions helped define the world we live in today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of post-war history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.